a homeless woman gave her last meal to a stranger. The next day, she saw his face on a billboard and couldn't believe it. The biting wind cut through the crowded city street, carrying with it a chill that seemed to seep into every corner of the bustling neighborhood. Jane pulled her thin jacket tighter, shivering as she huddled in a doorway. The city she once dreamed of had become her cage, its towering buildings and bright lights a stark reminder of how far she'd fallen. Just as she bit into her only meal of the day, a small sandwich she'd managed to save, she noticed a man sitting on a bench nearby, glancing around with an air of hopelessness. His clothes, though slightly worn, didn't indicate he was homeless. Yet, the look in his eyes mirrored the emptiness she felt herself. Her instinct told her to stay away, but something about his hollow gaze stopped her. Without a word, Jane walked over and offered him half of her sandwich. The man looked up, surprise and gratitude flashing across his face. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the city's hum. They exchanged few words, but something in that brief interaction lingered with her. She didn't know his name, or why he seemed so down, but sharing that meal felt oddly comforting, almost like an unspoken connection had been made. The next day, Jane wandered the streets, trying to keep warm. But as she passed by a large, glimmering billboard in Times Square, her heart nearly stopped. There, larger than life, was the stranger from yesterday, his face and name plastered across the ad space, under a headline that proclaimed him as a top CEO in the city. The world Jane inhabited was rough around the edges, a daily battle for survival. She navigated alleyways, familiar faces among the homeless forming an unspoken community of resilience. Every day was a repeat of the last, scanning streets for a bit of change, shielding herself from disapproving stares, and enduring the constant background hum of people who walked past without seeing her. For most, the city was a symbol of opportunity. But for Jane, it was the unforgiving place that had slowly stripped her of everything. Only a handful of people ever acknowledged her, and even fewer dared to speak to her. To them, she was invisible, part of the scenery. But the man she'd given her sandwich to yesterday had seen her, truly seen her, even if just for a moment. As the billboard continued to haunt her, Jane's curiosity grew. Why had he been in that park, looking as lost as she often felt? And how could a person who had it all, by the world's standards, seem so empty? Determined to find out more, she began spending time near the high-rise buildings that bore his company's logo. She asked around, subtly prying information from people who didn't realize her keen interest. It wasn't long before she discovered his name, Ethan Moore, a powerhouse in finance with a reputation for ambition and ruthlessness. And yet, there was a rumor. Ethan had recently suffered a devastating loss that had driven him to isolation. Employees whispered about a mysterious disappearance from the public eye and speculated that he was struggling to cope. Jane felt an inexplicable connection, her mind returning to the look of weariness in his eyes, so similar to her own. Their lives couldn't be more different, and yet, here they were, two people in a city of millions, both lost in their own way. Days passed, but Jane couldn't shake the image of Ethan on that billboard. His face lingered in her thoughts, a reminder of that brief, almost surreal interaction. She questioned herself repeatedly, why was she so fixated on him? Maybe it was because, despite his wealth and power, he looked just as lost as she felt. Or maybe it was the aching loneliness that had crept into her life, making even a single moment of connection feel monumental. Her thoughts turned to a plan she couldn't believe she was even considering, trying to see him again. She imagined how ridiculous it must seem. What would she say? Would he even remember her? The rational part of her mind told her to forget it, to leave well enough alone. But something deeper pushed her forward, a feeling she couldn't ignore. After a few days of gathering courage, Jane positioned herself near the towering corporate building where she'd learned he worked. The sheer size of it made her feel small, insignificant. As people bustled past, she imagined herself walking through those doors, confronting the polished, marble-clad world she no longer belonged to. Her heart hammered with every passing minute, and doubt clawed at her. Just when she was about to turn away, she spotted Ethan leaving through the side exit, his head down, shoulders slumped. Without thinking, she stepped forward, catching his gaze. His eyes widened slightly, recognizing her face in an instant. "You," he began, his voice soft, almost unsure. "You're the one from the park." Jane nodded, her voice caught in her throat. "What brings you here?" he asked, his tone filled with genuine curiosity but shadowed by something she couldn't quite place. She looked at him, then at the vast skyscraper behind him, feeling the weight of her decision. I just wanted to see if you were okay," she replied, her voice barely more than a whisper. Ethan's expression softened, a brief crack in his otherwise guarded demeanor. "Not many people ask me that." His words hung in the air, almost as if he didn't expect her to understand. But she did. They stood there in silence, the world around them bustling, oblivious. In that moment, it felt as though the noise had faded, leaving only two strangers connected by a shared sense of loss. Over the following weeks, Jane and Ethan's paths crossed more often. Each meeting brought them closer, yet neither dared to speak of the complexities in their lives. Ethan would sometimes linger, asking Jane questions about her life on the streets, while Jane carefully chose what she shared, holding her deepest struggles close. One evening, as they sat side by side on a park bench, Ethan opened up about his own struggles. "You probably think I have it all together," he said, staring at the ground. "But the truth is, I lost someone very close to me recently. My fiancée. She was the one who kept me grounded, kept me human. Without her, he paused, his voice breaking. "I don't even know who I am anymore." Jane listened, a pang of empathy coursing through her. She understood loss more intimately than most, having endured the gradual erosion of everything she'd once held dear. Without fully realizing it, she placed a hand on his arm, a simple gesture of comfort that surprised them both. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her own voice laced with memories of abandonment and loss. "It's hard to hold on to yourself when everything familiar disappears." Ethan looked at her, a hint of recognition in his eyes. They both knew the void that grief could carve into a person's life. But for Jane, who had spent years watching people pass her by without a second glance, Ethan's words stirred something different, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time: trust. With each conversation, Jane began to reveal parts of her past, carefully peeling back layers. She told him about the home she'd lost, the family she'd left behind, and the years she'd spent trying to find her way back. Ethan listened with an attentiveness that both comforted and unnerved her. As their connection deepened, Ethan began to question the life he'd been leading. His wealth, his status, all the things he'd once prided himself on, now felt hollow. Jane's resilience and honesty reminded him of the simplicity he'd longed for but never sought. She, in turn, found herself drawn to Ethan's kindness, a quality that was as rare as it was precious in her world. But just as they began to lower their defenses, a new obstacle loomed. Ethan's company was launching a major initiative, one that would directly impact the homeless communities in the area, potentially displacing hundreds of people, including Jane. This project, a legacy Ethan's late fiancée had been passionate about, now stood between them. The fallout from Ethan's announcement was swift and ruthless. News outlets ran with headlines about his breakdown, and his board demanded an immediate meeting to discuss the future of the project. Investors threatened to pull their funds, questioning his stability and loyalty to the company's mission. Some even hinted that he should step down as CEO, framing his decision as reckless and impulsive. In the days that followed, Ethan faced immense pressure to retract his statement, but he stood firm. He had the support of very few within the company, and he felt the walls closing in. Through it all, Jane was his anchor. She'd meet him in quiet corners of the city, lending an ear and sharing insights from her own life, reminding him of the importance of staying true to himself. "I've lost everything before," she told him one night, as they sat on the steps of an old library, "and the only thing that got me through was knowing that I was still me. If you start compromising now, you might lose more than just your position, you might lose yourself." Her words resonated deeply, but Ethan also felt torn. He knew he'd risked the company's stability, and part of him wondered if he'd done the right thing. With each passing day, the consequences of his decision grew heavier, and he found himself wrestling with guilt, questioning whether he'd acted selfishly. The project had been his fiancée's dream, a vision she'd crafted for years. In choosing Jane's perspective, had he betrayed her memory? One afternoon, as the pressure mounted, Ethan was pulled into a tense board meeting. His advisors and shareholders lined the room, their faces hardened, each demanding explanations, financial assurances, and a promise to proceed with the project as originally planned. Jane waited outside, anxious, knowing the stakes but unable to intervene. Inside, Ethan's frustration grew with each demand. His chest tightened, his mind racing through conflicting thoughts. But then, he remembered Jane's words, her unshakable resilience despite her circumstances. He felt a surge of clarity. Standing up, he addressed the board with a calm but firm voice. "I understand your concerns, but I'm standing by my decision. We need to rethink this project with the people it affects in mind. If that's not something this company stands for anymore, then maybe I'm not the right person to lead it." His words echoed through the room, a mixture of shock and silence. Outside, Jane saw him emerge from the room, looking both relieved and exhausted. Without a word, he joined her, and they walked out of the building together, feeling like they'd just crossed a point of no return. That night, as they sat together in quiet companionship, Jane's hand found his. The moment was brief, simple, yet filled with unspoken support. Neither knew what the future held, but for now, they had each other, and that was enough. As days turned into weeks, Ethan found himself navigating unfamiliar territory. The lavish parties, boardroom meetings, and polished personas that once defined his life felt distant. Now, he was working with the city council, meeting with advocates, and learning about the lives of those who would be affected by his company's project. Jane accompanied him to many of these meetings, her insight and genuine compassion a guiding light in every discussion. Ethan was no longer the high-powered CEO focused solely on profit margins, he was slowly becoming a man who valued impact over income. And as he did, he realized how much Jane had transformed him. Her strength in the face of adversity, her courage to be herself despite society's judgments, inspired him to dig deeper within himself, to be someone who could use his resources for genuine change. One afternoon, as they walked through a neighborhood affected by his project, they passed by a community shelter. Jane looked at it with a mixture of nostalgia and sadness. "I stayed there for a few weeks when I first lost my home," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan looked at her, seeing for the first time just how much she had endured. "I can't even imagine what that was like," he said, his voice filled with regret and respect. Jane smiled softly. "It wasn't easy, but it taught me to value every small kindness, every chance to start over. Sometimes, the hardest parts of our lives are what shape us the most." Her words stayed with Ethan. He realized that his wealth and privilege had sheltered him from many hardships, but now, he saw those things as opportunities to create a lasting impact. Over time, he made gradual changes to the project, advocating for the creation of affordable housing alongside corporate developments, and ensuring the community's needs were prioritized. Jane, meanwhile, found herself opening up in ways she hadn't anticipated. Through Ethan, she began to regain a sense of purpose and dignity. She started volunteering at the same shelter where she'd once found refuge, sharing her story with others and giving hope to those who needed it. Her connection with Ethan continued to grow, but more importantly, she felt as if she were finally reclaiming a part of herself she'd lost long ago. Together, they were slowly building something new, not just for themselves but for the people who had been overlooked and pushed aside. Ethan's company, once seen as a giant, now became a symbol of transformation, thanks to the changes he was implementing. And through this journey, he found a sense of purpose beyond anything his previous life had offered. As the project took shape, people began to notice Ethan's genuine commitment to change. The media, which once ridiculed his decision, now reported on the progress, and he became a reluctant but powerful advocate for corporate responsibility. And through it all, Jane remained by his side, a constant reminder of what he was fighting for. The grand opening of Ethan's reimagined project was just days away. The transformation of the original plan into a mixed-purpose development, featuring both affordable housing and corporate space, had attracted attention and mixed reactions. Investors were skeptical, but the city council and local communities had rallied behind Ethan's vision. The pressure was immense, and he knew that a single misstep could undo everything they'd worked toward. But just as things seemed to be coming together, Ethan received a piece of devastating news. His biggest investor was threatening to pull out, jeopardizing the entire project. This investor had been critical in funding the new housing initiative, and without their support, the plan could collapse. Worse still, Ethan's board was already considering replacements for his position, seeing his actions as a liability rather than an asset. The next few days were a blur of frantic meetings and negotiations, with Ethan barely holding the project together. Jane, sensing his stress, offered quiet encouragement, standing by him in every moment of doubt and despair. But one evening, as they walked through the construction site, Ethan's frustration finally boiled over. "I'm losing everything, Jane," he said, his voice cracking. "I put everything I had into making this right, but it's still not enough. Maybe I was wrong to think I could change things." Jane turned to him, her expression resolute. "You can't give up now. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about all the people who are counting on you to see this through. You've come too far to back down." Her words cut through his doubt, reigniting the determination he thought he'd lost. That night, Ethan made a bold decision. He sold a portion of his personal shares in the company, using the funds to cover the shortfall and ensure the project would move forward. It was a drastic move, one that would significantly impact his standing within the company, but he felt it was the only way to keep his promise to the community. At the opening ceremony, Ethan stood in front of the crowd, feeling a mix of relief and exhaustion. The project had survived, but he knew the cost had been high. As he delivered his speech, he glanced at Jane, who watched him with pride and admiration. Then, just as the crowd began to applaud, a familiar face appeared, a representative from the investor group who had pulled out, stepping up to announce a partnership to fund similar housing initiatives across the city. Ethan was stunned. The impact of his dedication had gone beyond saving one project, it had sparked a movement that would reach far beyond his original vision. As the crowd dispersed, Ethan found himself standing alone with Jane, the weight of everything finally lifting from his shoulders. They looked at each other, knowing that, in a way, they had saved each other. The night before the grand opening, Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat alone in his office, the lights of the city glittering below him, casting shadows across the empty room. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from board members, colleagues, and media outlets, all eager to hear how he would respond to the investor crisis and his risky financial maneuver. But at this point, he knew he had no choice but to forge ahead. His life's work, his company, and his very reputation were at stake. All he had now was his belief in what he was doing and the quiet hope that it would be enough. As dawn broke, Ethan left for the construction site to walk through it one final time. The site was still littered with scaffolding, equipment, and workers bustling to finish the last details before the opening. Ethan took it all in with a mix of pride and fear, knowing that if anything went wrong, everything he had sacrificed would be in vain. At the far end of the site, he saw Jane speaking with some of the workers, her presence a comforting constant in the midst of chaos. She glanced up, saw him, and made her way over, her smile like a lighthouse guiding him back to shore. "I wasn't sure you'd show up," she teased gently, though her eyes held a trace of worry. Ethan managed a tired smile. I wasn't sure I'd make it either. But I guess it's too late to turn back now. She placed a hand on his arm, a simple touch that held the weight of everything they'd shared. You're doing something remarkable, Ethan. No matter what happens today, know that you've already made a difference. As the morning wore on, people began to gather for the opening ceremony. Ethan watched the crowd swell, a mix of city officials, media personnel, and community members who had come to witness this unprecedented project. His nerves frayed as he caught sight of several members of his board, their expressions hard, silently reminding him of the stakes. But there were also familiar faces from the homeless community, people he'd come to know through Jane, who now looked at him with hope. Ethan took his place on the stage, heart pounding as he faced the sea of expectant faces. He glanced down at his prepared speech, the carefully crafted words that had been approved by his PR team. But as he scanned the crowd, his eyes found Jane's, and he knew he couldn't rely on a script today. This moment required truth, not polish. He took a deep breath, set his notes aside, and spoke from his heart. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. When I first embarked on this project, I had a very different vision in mind. Like many of us, I was focused on growth, profits, and the legacy of my company. I wanted to build something big, something impressive. But over the past few months, I've come to realize that true legacy isn't measured by the size of our buildings or the numbers on our financial statements. It's measured by the impact we have on the lives around us. A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Ethan pressed on, his voice growing stronger. This project almost didn't happen. We lost a major investor and faced enormous pressure to abandon the affordable housing initiative. I know some of you here today questioned my decision, and perhaps even my sanity. But standing here now, I can tell you that choosing to put people first is the best decision I've ever made. It's not easy, and I don't expect everyone to understand. But I believe that we can no longer turn a blind eye to the needs of our community. He felt a weight lifting as he spoke, each word bringing him closer to his own truth. I was fortunate enough to meet someone who changed my perspective entirely, he continued, glancing briefly at Jane. She reminded me that success isn't about standing alone at the top, it's about reaching back and helping others rise with you. Ethan's eyes scanned the audience, catching the skeptical gaze of his board members, the hopeful faces of community leaders, and the surprise on the faces of reporters who had followed his story. He felt a surge of conviction, stronger than anything he'd felt before. At that moment, the crowd began to shift, and Ethan noticed a tall figure stepping forward. It was his lead investor, the one who had nearly pulled the plug on the entire project. The man approached the stage, an unreadable expression on his face. Ethan's heart dropped, bracing for what felt like an inevitable confrontation. The investor reached the microphone, his gaze fixed firmly on Ethan. For a moment, the tension was palpable, the entire crowd holding its breath as they waited to see what would happen next. Mr. Moore, the investor began, his voice booming, I've seen many CEOs in my time. I've seen men chase after profits, break promises, and abandon principles for the sake of business. But I have never seen a man stand so firmly for his beliefs, even when it meant risking everything. Ethan felt a shock of surprise, barely able to process the words. After hearing your speech, I realized that what you're doing here is more than just a business venture. It's a mission. And while I had my doubts, I can see now that this city needs more leaders like you, the investor continued, turning to the crowd. I'm proud to announce that I am not only reinstating my investment but doubling it, to support similar projects across the city. The crowd erupted in applause, and Ethan felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He glanced at Jane, who was cheering with the rest, her smile brighter than he'd ever seen. The moment felt surreal, as if all the sacrifices, the sleepless nights, and the impossible decisions had finally led to this point. As the investor stepped back, Ethan returned to the microphone, his voice steady, filled with gratitude. Thank you. This is more than I could have ever hoped for. And I want to promise each of you here today that this is just the beginning. Together, we can create a future where no one is left behind, where everyone has a place to call home. The rest of the ceremony was a blur of handshakes, congratulations, and emotional exchanges. For the first time, Ethan felt at peace, a sense of purpose that went beyond any financial gain or corporate victory. Later that evening, as the last of the crowd dispersed, Ethan and Jane found themselves alone, standing amidst the newly constructed buildings. They looked out at the illuminated skyline, a testament to all they'd achieved together. "You did it, Ethan," Jane whispered, her voice filled with awe. "No," he replied, turning to her with a smile. "We did it." In that quiet moment, they knew that this was more than just a victory, it was the start of a new journey, a partnership grounded in purpose and resilience, and a promise to continue building a better world, one step, one choice at a time. In the weeks that followed the grand opening, Jane's life began to change in ways she had once only dreamed of. Ethan had quietly arranged for her to stay in a newly renovated apartment near the heart of the community project, a modest but cozy space that offered warmth, safety, and, most importantly, a sense of dignity. The day he revealed the apartment to her was one Jane would never forget. As they stood together on the front steps, she struggled to hold back tears, her gaze moving from the welcoming building to Ethan's gentle smile. The disbelief and joy blended together, overwhelming her. "I wanted you to have a place of your own," Ethan said, his voice soft but resolute. "You've been a guiding light for me, Jane, in ways I don't think I'll ever be able to repay. This is just the beginning." Jane's eyes were misty as she stepped inside, taking in the warm glow of the small but thoughtfully decorated apartment. Simple furniture adorned the rooms, and the kitchen was stocked with fresh ingredients, another thoughtful touch from Ethan. There was a warmth here that she hadn't felt in years, an unmistakable sense of belonging. That night, as they shared dinner in her new home, Jane looked around, absorbing every detail. Each room, each corner, seemed to carry a promise of security and new beginnings. For someone who had once lived in the shadows of the city, fighting every day just to survive, this apartment was more than just shelter, it was freedom. The freedom to imagine a life with stability, friendships, and possibilities she hadn't dared to believe were meant for her. "Thank you, Ethan," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. I never thought I'd feel at home again." Ethan reached for her hand, his expression warm and sincere. "Jane, you've given me more than you know. It's only right that you have a place where you can feel safe, where you can start again." Days turned into weeks, and Jane found herself building routines in her new life. She became deeply involved in the community, volunteering at the same shelters she had once relied on, sharing her story and guiding others who were still struggling. Her presence was a source of inspiration, her story a testament to resilience and second chances. The bond between her and Ethan grew stronger, their friendship deepening as they navigated this new chapter together. Ethan visited often, and they would spend hours talking about future projects, discussing ways to bring more opportunities to those who had been overlooked. Jane's insights became a vital part of Ethan's new initiatives, and he trusted her perspective more than anyone else's. One evening, Ethan surprised her with news of a new plan, an outreach program that would provide training, education, and support to those in need, modeled after Jane's journey. He wanted her to help lead it, to be the face of the initiative. The idea floored her. "You want me to run this?" she asked, her voice filled with a mixture of shock and pride. "Yes," Ethan replied, smiling. "Who better to guide others than someone who's been through it herself? You have the heart, the experience, and the wisdom. You'd be incredible at this." Overwhelmed but deeply touched, Jane agreed. The program launched within months, and Jane became a leader and advocate, helping people find their way just as she had. The city came to know her name, her story, and her strength, and she became a symbol of hope for countless others who were struggling. As for her relationship with Ethan, it grew beyond friendship into a partnership grounded in respect, admiration, and something neither of them had expected, a deep, unspoken love. They found solace in each other's presence, a quiet understanding that went beyond words. One evening, as they stood on her apartment balcony, watching the city lights blink against the night sky, Jane turned to Ethan, gratitude shining in her eyes. "You saved me, you know." Ethan shook his head, a gentle smile tugging at his lips. "No, Jane. You saved me." They stood together in comfortable silence, two souls who had once been worlds apart, now bound by a shared purpose and an unwavering trust. The journey that had begun with a simple act of kindness had transformed both of their lives in ways they could never have foreseen. Together, they had built something lasting, a legacy of compassion, resilience, and hope. And as they looked out over the city they had both come to love, they knew that their journey was far from over. This was only the beginning. Months passed, and Jane's life blossomed into one she had once thought impossible. Her program was thriving, reaching people across the city, providing them with not only resources but a true sense of belonging. She had become a fixture in the community, known for her story, her kindness, and her unwavering commitment to giving others a second chance. Ethan, ever by her side, continued to support and grow their shared vision. Together, they attended community events, spoke at city forums, and inspired countless others to get involved. What had started as a single act of kindness had grown into a powerful movement, driven by the belief that everyone, no matter their past, deserved hope and dignity. One evening, Jane looked out over the community center from her office window, watching as families gathered and children laughed in the courtyard. She knew she had found her purpose, her place. And in Ethan, she had found more than a partner, she had found her truest friend and the love she had thought was lost to her. Their story, built from resilience and compassion, was only beginning, and both were ready for whatever lay ahead. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect on the power of kindness. Small acts of compassion, like Jane's simple offering of a meal, can create ripples that change lives. Dizzy. Join the conversation. What's one small way you can help someone today? Share your thoughts in the comments and help spread a little more hope and kindness in the world. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and follow for more inspiring stories of resilience and transformation.